Okay, this is test 5, section 3 of the College Board official 2016 study guide for SAT. Which of the following is an equation of line L in the xy plane above? Well, we know that the equation of a line is y equals mx plus b. It has b, which is the y-intercept. In this case is 1. And it also has the slope, which is how much up and how much over. So we go up 1 over 1. Okay, so we just get y equals x plus 1. The circle above with center O has a circumference equal to 36. And we've memorized our circumference formula, which is 2 pi radius. And then we can therefore plug this in for C. 2 pi radius equals 36. Divide by 2 pi, divide by 2 pi. So we can actually figure out the radius. In this case, it's 18 over pi. May or may not need it. So what is the length of minor arc AC? So minor arc AC is here. And if you notice, it actually corresponds to this 90-degree angle. And 90 out of 360 is what that would be. So this, of course, can be reduced to 1/4, right? Because 90 goes to 360 4 times. So we're dealing with 1/4 of the circle. So if its total circumference around the edge is 36, we could take 1/4 of that, which equals 9. 9, 9, 9, and 9. Okay. What are the solutions of the quadratic equation here? Multiple ways to do this. We can plug in, for example. Yeah, that's not a bad route. Let's try that. But the first thing I would do is to factor out the 4. It's just kind of screaming to be factored out. X squared minus 2x minus 3, and then divide by 4 on both sides. X squared minus 2x minus 3 equals 0. So then I can plug in 1. So 1 squared is 1 minus 2 times 1 minus 3. So that's not going to work. 1 minus 5, right? It's not 0. So anything with 1 is out. So now I just have to test 3 to see if that works. 3 squared is 9 minus 2 times 3 is 6 minus 3. That does work. All right. So I know that choice B must be the right answer. Which of the following is an example of a function whose graph in the xy plane has no x-intercepts? So no x-intercepts means that you don't cross the x-axis. So an example of that would be a parabola that doesn't touch the x-axis, right? So a linear function whose rate of change is not 0. So the only way to do it with a linear function, right, that is to say, the only way to have it not cross the x-axis if it's parallel to the x-axis, which means that it would have a slope of 0. And another word for slope is rate of change. So assuming we have a non-zero slope, that means that we're not in that situation. So we will cross. All right. A quadratic function with real zeros. Well, if it has zeros, obviously that's not a good candidate. One with no real zeros, that's going to be the winner, right? And with at least one real zero. If you know what that x-intercept means 0, then you know those two choices are just ridiculous. All right, so from here we would add x to both sides because we always want to isolate the radical. Then we square both sides. That gets rid of the radical. Now, since x equals to 9, we can plug that in here. 9 squared, of course, is 81. And then we can subtract 2 from both sides to get 79 for k. Which of the following is the equivalent to the sum of these expressions? Right? So we want to add these together. The plus 1 and minus 1 cancels. So we're left with a squared plus a. Jackie has 2 summer jobs. She works as a tutor, which pays $12 per hour. And she works as a lifeguard, which pays $9.50 per hour. She can work no more than 20 hours per week, but she wants to earn at least $220 per week. Which of the following systems of inequalities represents this situation in terms of x and y, where x is the number of hours she tutors? Okay, so she makes $12 an hour for tutoring, $12 per hour, and she works for x hours. So if I multiply those numbers together, I'll get the number that has units of dollars. So 12x has units of dollars, right? Similarly, 950y would have units of dollars, And so we want that to equal $220 per week. Okay, dollars, dollars, dollars. Good. All right, so this is basically your dollars equation. All right. And yes, it is an inequality. We want at least this, so we could also have greater than 220. Right? So we can scan and see if we can eliminate anything based on that. Yes, so these have the inequality sign the wrong way. And these two have it correct. So now you can see that the other equation is going to involve hours. So if I add the number of hours she tutors and the number of hours she lifeguards, we want that to be no more than 20. But it could be less than 20 or equal to 20. So the best answer choice would be the one that has both of those correctly done. In air, the speed of sound s in meters per second is a linear function of the air temperature T, given by this equation. Which of the following statements is the best interpretation of the number 331.4 in this context? So clearly this is your value of b, also known as the y-intercept, and that, as you may know, generally represents the starting point. Okay, pictorially, it's where your function begins to either descend or ascend. When sort of the x value is 0, that's what your height is going to be. And it always is going to have the same units as the number that is the output, right? So the output in this case, s, is given in meters per second. So we know that this has to have the same units as the output, so it has to have meters per second. So speed of sound in meters per second, those are good. The increase in speed of sound in meters per second, well, that would have to be meters per second per degree Celsius. So anyway, those are out. It's this, right? You want it to be at 0 degrees C. You want your input value to be 0 for your y-intercept. If xy is a solution to the system of equations above, what is the value of xy? Okay. So this I'm going to plug in for y right here. So we get 2x squared plus 6 equals, and then I could distribute the 2 here if I choose. 2x plus 6. I could subtract 6 from both sides at this point. They cancel out. Okay. And I can also divide by 2 on both sides. Alright, that will give me this. And at this point, I can then subtract the x to the left, because whenever you have a quadratic, you want all the items on the one side and have 0 on the other side, right? Then at this point, I can factor out an x, and I have x minus 1. Then I could t-chart x equals 0 and x equals 1, right? So those are my two solutions. I know that x has to be greater than 0, so the only one I can choose is 1. If a squared plus b squared is z, and ab is equal to, sorry, wait a second, partial answer. Oh, they got me again. Partial answer. So x comma y. So I have to plug back in to get y. Y is equal to x squared. So in this case, y is equal to 1 squared. So y is equal to 1. So then the product xy would be 1 times 1, which is still 1. So lucked out there. A squared plus b squared is z, and ab is y. Which of the following is equivalent to that? All right. So let's see what they have in store for us here. So 4z plus 8y. So we probably should plug in our value for z here, and we plug in our value for y here. So 4 times this quantity plus 8 times this quantity, right? And we can distribute from here. So 4a squared plus 4b squared plus 8ab. So then what you notice is that this is a quadratic situation, or what you may notice. Now, you can start working these backwards if you do get stuck here. But at this point, you may recognize this as being sort of factorable, right? And so what you do is you sort of take the square root of this guy, and that gives you 2a, all right? And then you take the square root of this guy, and that gives you a 2b, All right, and if you do this correctly, you will get, the cross terms will be 4ab and another 4ab. So you'll get the 8ab in the middle. So this is like a sum of perfect squares, which is a lot less well known than the difference of perfect squares, also known as dots. But anyway, this leads us to choose choice B, right? 2a plus 2b quantity squared. The volume of a right circular cylinder, which we know the formula for, is 22 cubic centimeters. So we can plug that in for V. What is the volume in cubic centimeters of a right circular cylinder with twice the radius and half the height? So really, this is a proportionality question. We want to know the proportionality with regards to the radius and the height. Okay. So what we can do is we can take r and replace it with 2r, and we can replace h with half of h, right? Or h over 2, in other words. So let's go into this formula and see what we can do. So the radius we're going to replace with 2 radius, and the height with height over 2. Okay. Now this squaring operation ends up hitting that 2 that we put in there. So it ends up being 4r squared, right? And then, so the new pieces here are the h and the 2 here. Okay. So we end up with basically 4 over 2, which is 2 pi r squared h. So this 2 is the new item. So basically the volume doubled, if you could tell, because it's 2 times what it originally was. So if it was originally 22, now it'll be 44. Which of the following is equivalent to this? So we know it's power over root, power and root. So we know we have a fourth root, and we have got 9 to the third power. Okay, so that's not a choice. All right. But we know already we can eliminate this because this is supposed to have a third power on the 9. Okay. Similarly, we're not taking a cubed root of 9. But, alright, anyway. So we can then interpret this fourth root as being 2 square roots. So another way to look at it is to do a square root and then another square root. And in fact, I can do these 3 operations in any order I choose. So I'm going to take 9, I'm going to do a square root, I'm going to do another square root, and then I'm going to raise that to the third power. Because remember, these multiply. So that would equal the 3/4, wouldn't it? Square root of 9 is 3, so I have 3 to the 1/2 to the third, and then 3 to the 1/2 is really rad 3. And I have to raise that to the third, which means I need 3 copies of that. Okay? And then the first 2 copies makes a full 3. So I end up with choice D. At a restaurant, n cups of tea are made by adding tea bags to hot water. If t is equal to n plus 2, how many additional tea bags are needed to make each additional cup of tea? So this is kind of like a change in y over change in x type deal, right? If I want to make 1 extra cup of tea, how many different tea bags do I need? So for a delta x to be 1, right, because x in this case is really n, right, is the independent variable, and n really represents cups of tea, so we want 1 additional cup of tea, so we want delta x to be 1. What would delta y have to be, is the question. And I claim the answer is 1. The reason is we could look at our linear function and determine what the slope is by checking out the coefficient in front of our independent variable. So we find m is equal to 1, and we interpret m as change in y over change in x, which is really going to be 1 over 1, you see. So that's where those ones come from. Okay. The function f is defined by the equation above. Which of the following is the graph of y equals minus f of x in the xy plane? Alright. So we could look at this and then we could do a reflection in so to make y negative we'd have to reflect in the x-axis. That's one option, right? So what would the original function look like? Well, it is a, so we could start with 2 to the x and we could add 1 to it, right? So what does 2 to the x look like? Well, at x equals 0, right, if you plug in 0, 2 to the 0 is 1. So that's an intercept of 1. But then, it grows very rapidly. So it goes to 2 to the first, which is 2. All right, 2 to the 0, 2 to the first, 2 to the second. These are your outputs, which are 1, 2, and 4. And then it goes to 8, and it starts doubling every interval. So anyway, it grows very rapidly. That's y equals 2 to the x. But then I have to add 1 to that, right? It's a transformation, which is to increase the y value by 1. So effectively now, this is occurring at y equals 2. I shifted everything up by 1 just then, whereas originally that would have been 1, okay? At this point, I now need to apply the negative transformation here, which is to flip everything in the x-axis, okay? So that instead, I actually have a picture that looks like this for y equals negative 2 to the x plus 1. So that's the picture I expect to see. And the only one that does it correctly is choice C, because it has this negative 2 as the intercept, which is what it should be. Alan drives an average of 100 miles each week. His car can travel an average of 25 miles per gallon of gasoline. Alan would like to reduce his weekly expenditure on gas by $5. Assuming gas costs $4 per gallon, which equation can Alan use to determine how many fewer average miles he should drive each week? This is a very hard question, okay? Can't stress that enough. I think it's pretty unfair for them to ask this. But let's see if we can make some headway anyway. So, first of all, we can list out some quantities along with their units. So, Alan drives 100 miles per week, right? His car can travel 25 miles per gallon. So we can list that out. And he'd like to reduce his weekly expenditure of gasoline by $5. So that's $5 per week reduction. Now, assuming gasoline costs $4 per gallon, so that's $4 per gallon, is, again, we're sort of making our list here by way of dimensional analysis. Assuming gasoline, which equation can he use to determine how many fewer miles? All right, so we also want a mileage reduction. So we want a miles per week reduction, okay? So the key thing is that these are both reductions, right? Which is the unfair part, you see. Because, you know, if they sort of told us the miles per week, we could have figured out how many dollars per week. It would have been a nice dimensional analysis question. But here they've gone too far, right? But anyway, we can learn a little bit about how the dimensional analysis works just by sort of looking at the units, okay? So anyway, we're looking for something in miles per week. So let's see. Okay, maybe we should take this longer route. Yeah, shall we do the long route? Yeah, by the way, this is it. The number is m miles per week. Let's see. Well, the one thing that we can check is for consistency amongst the units, right? So we need the units on the left side and the right side to be equal. So that's something that we can check for. Let's see. Right. So if we use this reduction amount, right? Yeah, let's start with that perhaps. So, well, actually, if we want miles per week in the end, yeah, so we'll use the reduction number. Okay, so these two are basically out, right? Because we want the reduction to be 5, okay? And m is with regards to reduction as well. So let's see. I know that 5 has units of miles per week reduction. So I'd like, for the left side, to have the same units. Let's test it out. So 4 has got units of dollars per gallon. And then 25 has got units of miles per gallon. All right? So when we divide them, we can keep, change, flip. gallons per mile. Gallons will cancel. I get dollars per mile. And then the number m has got what? Miles per week. Yeah, this problem is a mess. I don't like this problem. I'm skipping it. 16. Maria plans to rent a boat. The boat rental costs $60 per hour. $60 per hour. She will have to pay for a water safety course that costs $10. Okay, so we have to multiply this by X hours, right? Then slap on a $10 fee, and this will be our cost function, C. Maria wants to spend no more than $280, right? So this no more than means less than or equal to $280, right? And by the way, both items have the correct units of dollars. So we can then drop the units, right? If the boat rental is only available for a whole number of hours, what is the number of hours she can rent the boat? So we have to solve this inequality. So we subtract 10. Okay. So that gives us 60x less than or equal to 270. Then divide that by 60, right? And we find that x is less than or equal to 60 goes in 4 times, and then there's 0.5. Okay, so 4.5 hours. Yeah. So the maximum she can do is 4 hours, because she can't do 5 hours, else she would be over the limit of 280. Alright, so here I would start by distributing. Okay, so we get 2p plus 2 plus 8p minus 8 equals 5p. So this 8p and 2p makes 10p, and the numbers here makes negative 6. Then we could subtract 10p. Okay, we find negative 6 equals negative 5p, divide by negative 5, and we find that p is equal to 6/5. Right? Okay, the system of equations above has solution this. What is the value of x? So you could plug this in for y, and we get 1/2 2x plus 2x equals 21 over 2. And the first thing I would do here is I would double both sides. So what that would do is the double cancels the half, and this 2 cancels with this 2. Just makes things nice and simple. Then the left side is clearly going to be 4x equals 21. Divide by 4, and you'd find x is 21/4. Alright, so we're on the last 2 here. And the expression above is equivalent to this, so why not have it equal that, right? X plus 2 squared. X is not equal to negative 2. What is the value of a? Right. So what we see here is that we'd like to have a common denominator throughout the entire thing. So to do that, you might think of squaring top and bottom here, but that's not good, because that's not something you're allowed to do, right? If I had 1/2 and I squared top and bottom, it's 1/4, which is not equal. So that operation doesn't preserve equality. Whereas if I multiply by the same thing on top and bottom, that will do the trick, right? Because that is equal to 1, which it doesn't change the value. So anyway, 2x plus 6, and then this is going to become 2x plus 4, except for this minus that's out in front. Okay. The minus is going to have to distribute, right? So that means I have 2x plus 6 minus 2x minus 4. Okay. And of course these two x's will cancel. 6 minus 4 of course is 2. And the bottoms I can also cancel, because I can move this one up here, for example, and then they just cross out. So the key thing there is once you get a situation where you have bottoms all the same, you can then just disappear the bottom and just deal with the top. But anyway, you get a equals 2 as your answer. Intersecting lines are shown below. What is the value of x? Alright, so there's a few ways to do this, but perhaps the most straightforward way is to use sort of straight angles. So this would have to add up to 180 with whatever's inside here. So the inside part you can label as 180 minus x. so that when you add x, you get 180, right? Same thing here. This has to add up to 180, so call this actually 74, which is 180 minus 106. And finally, these three inside have to add up to 180. 74 plus 23. Right. Now I could subtract 180 from both sides. That would kill this. And you could swing the x to the other side. And then you can add these numbers together. You get 97 for x.